Hello, everyone. I have like an hour to play. I want to finish this video and try to learn Glisten Demon.
Fair. I mean, you know, there are other asymmetries between the good god hypothesis and the evil god hypothesis that we can't get into. Again, like the literature on this is very vast, so I just want to alert the audience that we haven't covered all the potential asymmetries.
Sure.
But yeah, I think C tier is fair. I mean, it's not like it's a knockdown argument, but it's also not like it's like silly, you know. Like professional philosophers take this very seriously.
So we've got this now. We've got every tier covered except for F, which is you know kind of nice. Maybe some people think there's an atheistic bias going on. I would wholeheartedly reject the charge, but then I wouldn't I?
Well, we also did put an F tier when we did the theistic arguments. I will point that out to people. We had no F tier, if I recall correctly.
Is that right? Did we not do that?
I think so.
There you have it, folks. We are fair and balanced on within reason. What do you think about looking at some of these slightly less popular, less well-known, less well-trodden arguments for atheism that you've provided for me?
Let's do it. Let's do it. So I guess the next one is going to be the improvability argument. I don't know what to call it, but yeah, like I said to the audience, like philosopher Felipe Leon on his blog has like 200 or so arguments on there, and they're linked. It's not like they're all in this gigantic post. They're linked to various other papers and books and so on in which they've been defended. And a lot of these are like ones that haven't been popularized because, you know, there aren't like there isn't like $1 billion industry which is like apologetics for atheism or something like that. So, but if there were, we get a lot of people picking up a lot of these arguments and shoving them down people's throats. So let's get to the improvability argument. So there are different ways to sort of construe this kind of argument. Here's just one way. So I guess the first premise would be something like, if God exists, then it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world. That seems pretty plausible. Like, the world could be improved in certain ways. Like, it could have created more happy people. Or like our pleasure could have been like adjusted 10% up. So it was like every instance of pleasure was like a 10% increase without affecting anything else. Or, you know, like maybe certain instances of evil could have been prevented and the world would have been slightly better. Or maybe God could have just made a different causally isolated universe. If you think our universe is on the whole good, which theists are apt to think, then maybe God could have just created a separate causally isolated universe, which is exactly like ours, which, you know, is on the whole good. You know, the common thought here is that God could have created like more happy people, and that would have been a good thing, and the world would have been at least slightly better if God had done that. So, if God exists, then it seems possible for God to create a better world than the actual world. If you disagree with this, you're going to think that the actual world, if you think if God exists, then it's not possible for God to create a better world than the actual world. So the actual world is either the best possible world or like tied for the best possible world. So like the world couldn't be improved in any way whatsoever, like to make a better world, and that doesn't seem particularly plausible, and most theists haven't want to go that route. Okay, so that premise seems kind of plausible. The next premise is that, well, if it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world, well, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. And you might think that this is just intuitively plausible. Think of a kind of artist analogy. Right, like pick Van Gogh or something. Van Gogh made various artworks. It seems like Van Gogh would have been a greater artist if he had made even better art. We'd rate him more highly.
This shit does not seem.
He'd be a greater artist. Similarly, you're a greater inventor if you make a better invention. And so, by analogy, it seems that also like you'd be a greater creator if you make a better creation. So then it would follow that if it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. Just like if it's possible for Van Gogh to create better artwork than he did in the actual world, it's possible for him to be a better artist than he actually is. Moreover, if God were to create a better world, it seems like in that world he'd be responding to and acting on better reasons, right? Because reasons more strongly favor creating a better world than creating a lesser world. And so then, it seems like in the world where he creates a better world compared to the actual world, yeah, like I said, he seems to be responding to and acting on better reasons, and that seems to reflect better on him as an agent. Maybe he'd also be more praiseworthy or something like that, but regardless, there does seem to be at least some intuitive motivation here for thinking that if it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. So from those two premises, it's going to follow that if God exists, it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. But alas, if God is perfect, then God is a perfect, if God exists, then God is a perfect being, right? And it's not possible, arguably, it's not possible for a perfect being to be better in any respect than it actually is. This is just what perfection is, right? If you can be improved upon, you're not perfect, you're not maximally perfect. And so then, since if God exists, then God will be perfect, and it's not possible for a perfect being to be better in any respect, it follows that if God exists, then it's actually not possible for God to be better in any respect than he actually is. And notice what we've just delivered. Earlier I argued that if God exists, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. But we also just concluded that if God exists, then that's not possible.
God.
And so then it follows that God doesn't exist. To see how that follows, suppose we have the following two things, like if P, then Q, and also if P, then not Q. How can we infer the negation of P from that? Well, suppose that P were true. By our two premises, we could derive both Q and not Q, right? So we'd be able to derive a contradiction.
Yep.
And if you make an assumption, and you derive a contradiction from that assumption, it follows that your assumption is false. And so P would have to be false. And so similarly, God doesn't exist from this sort of argument. For the audience, I'm not here to say that this argument is a definitive proof that it succeeds. I just think it's interesting and it spawns really cool thoughts, and that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Right, yeah. It's interesting. There's lots to think about there, of course. The idea, I guess the first idea to unpack is this idea that God could always improve upon the world. I think this is kind of plausible. Like, there's difficulty in trying to imagine a sort of maximally great world, because like even just by like creating another planet Earth, like somewhere outside, maybe like a multiverse, you just add like another universe. Although maybe a multiverse that's genuinely infinite would sort of be filled up. I don't know. It gets a bit weird. You know, it seems like you can always just create another Earth. You can always just like double the amount of people and make sure that they're all like happy. And that seems like a good thing. So it does seem plausible to me that there can always be improvements made. The next thing to say is that God would always choose to do that. I mean, you could say, given that it's impossible to have a maximally great world, God sort of has morally good reason to just arbitrarily pick a sort of state of goodness and just be like, this is what I'm running with. But that does seem a bit arbitrary. It does seem a bit weird. But if it's a choice between doing that and not creating a world at all, it seems like maybe he would prefer that. But like, okay, I guess that's the like, I'm not gonna contest the first assumption that the world could be made better. What I'm going to contest is that God could have done that, and also that by doing so he would be a quote better God. You gave the example of Van Gogh, or rather Van Gogh, and how if he created better paintings, he'd be a better painter. This probably has something to do with the standards by which we're judging. Let's just call him Vincent. By which we're judging him, right? God doesn't seem to be, in most religious traditions, judged by like some kind of like epistemic survey or some like empirical survey of the things that he creates. You know, God is not as good as the earth he makes. God is this maximally great, perfect being that sort of exists out in the ether or whatever, and like creates the world, and could create it worse, could create it better, can sort of do what he wants. But like his goodness would exist even if he never created anything. If he just sort of existed in all of his glory, he would still be perfectly good. In a way that Van Gogh, if he created no paintings, arguably he could have still been like a really good painter if it just so happened that he magically had this ability to paint without practice. But like, we want to say if Van Gogh didn't paint any paintings, he wouldn't be a great painter. If God didn't create any universes, people would probably say he's still a maximally great being. Which means that this assumption that to create a better world would make you a better God probably breaks down.
So I think that's where the debate is going to lie. I think that's, or like, yeah, not as in like knowingly tell a falsehood, but like that's where the debate is going. I think this is probably where, yeah, theists should reject the premise. I mean, it is hard to deny that there's some kind of intuitive plausibility behind the premise, and you know, ultimately that's what we're relying on when we mount arguments for and against God's existence. We're just ultimately, we can't mount arguments and premises ad infinitum, right? So you have to stop at some kind of premise eventually, and what do you say on behalf of it other than no, it just seems really plausible. So I think that maybe they don't find it plausible, but like it's hard to deny that there's some sort of plausibility behind it. I don't know. I mean, maybe they'll construe goodness as kind of like dispositional. So like Van Gogh, or whatever it is, Van Gogh, how good he is as a painter maybe that's like more so kind of like intrinsic dispositional thing, and it can manifest in various ways. But like, had it manifested in a better painting than it did in the actual world, doesn't necessarily mean that he's a better painter, just because that's a matter of his sort of like intrinsic capabilities and his kind of disposition.
This is not
right?
out of thing. This is just.
It just maybe sometimes they manifest
It's a
in
very peculiar thing.
a better painting, and
Alright.
sometimes they manifest in a slightly worse painting. But the goodness of the painter is a function solely of the capacities
What's going on
to like
here?
concoct in your mind a beautiful scene, and then the
Yeah,
capacity
maybe a
to
better
kind of
example here is like being a good singer. That might help sort of understand this a bit better. I mean, more conceivably, you could just naturally be a really, really good singer, but you never sing. You literally just never sing in your entire life. You never sing a song, but you're still a really good singer. In a way that someone who's a worse singer than you might make better music, might put things out into the world, but they're still like a worse singer, because being a good singer isn't dependent on what you put out. It's dependent on what you like could put out if you want.
Yeah, it's like your intrinsic capacities. Yeah. So like then the thought would be that, well, then likewise, it's not possible for God to be better in some respects than he actually is, because his goodness is a matter of sort of like his intrinsic character and his intrinsic capacities as well. So that's one way that you could go. I mean, does this address though? So that addresses one kind of motivation for the premise. I mean, one might still contest it. One might find it still intuitively plausible that Van Gogh would have been a better painter. I mean, like, arguably we all have like the intrinsic capacity to develop ourselves in various ways to, be really, really good at painting. We spend so much time at it and so on. But like, that doesn't make me as good of a painter as Van Gogh or something. So anyway, there are ways that one could push back on this. But like, there was another kind of line of motivation for that premise, which was that
Right.
when God is creating a better world, it seems like like the reasons to create a better world seem to they seem to be better reasons than the reasons to create a worse world. Like you have more reason to create a better world compared to a worse world. It seems like I don't know, that seems really plausible. Just like if you're making a painting, you have more reason to make a better painting than you do to make a worse painting. So then
Alright.
if that's the case, so then it seems like
What is
in
this
the world
symbol?
in which God creates in the world in which that world is better and God creates it compared to this world,
What
better
is
than the
that?
actual world, it seems like in that world God is responding to and acting on better reasons than he does in the actual world. And doesn't that seem to reflect better on him as an agent? He's acting on better reasons than he does in the actual world. So maybe that line of reasoning for the premise doesn't succumb to the same sort of objection. Again, it's maybe. I'm putting this forward for people as food for thought.
Yeah, I think it's interesting at any rate. I do like these considerations of God and possible worlds and all of this kind of stuff. Like, I've thought about this before in terms of the problem of evil. Like, why isn't there less suffering? And there's kind of an argument that can be said like, well, the world could always be morally improved. There could always be more pleasure and more good and all this kind of stuff. So in order for any universe to exist at all, God has to sort of arbitrarily pick. And so to make the complaint that the world could be better actually is undermined by the fact that that's always the case. And so it doesn't matter what universe you find yourself in, you could be making some kind of problem of evil case as to like why the world isn't better. And so it's sort of like this kind of consideration I think can cut both ways depending on the context in which it comes up. But as an argument for atheism, I think it's interesting. I mean, interesting is, I suppose, one of the measurements by which we might rank this, but also it's convincingness. It's convincingness, if that's a word.
God help me.
What do you think, Joe? Where does this sort of sit for you in terms of its actual power?
Right. Well, I mean, it's certainly not knocked down. It's going to be very hard to find knockdown arguments for or against God's existence. It's not like atrociously bad. I mean, it's not like the stone paradox. So
I mean,
I'm thinking
I
somewhere in the middle.
think-
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, we've got sort of universe big, and we've got evil God. Universe big is in B tier, evil God is in C tier. So compared to those arguments,
It's close to both of them. I'd say it's close to. I'd say it's closer to the evil God challenge. So maybe C tier. Maybe that's where I'm leaning.
sort of, because let me think about this.
I mean, it's a fascinating argument. It brings up lots of interesting topics about what determines the greatness of
This
being.
part.
And
Yeah,
I mean, each of the premises has a degree of plausibility. Like it's not like it can't be supported, and it's not like each premise is like ludicrous.
I think I'm just not convinced on this. Like, a better created universe would mean a better God. It's like, you know, if the universe had an extra planet in it with more people being happy, God is like a better being by his nature.
I don't
kind of is
fucking like
necessary,
this
or is like a
out of sync
requirement of this
bullshit.
argument.
Let's click here.
It's sort of, I don't know, there could be like a myriad of different reasons why like the universe is as it is and not an improved version of it, which I mean, we probably don't even have time to begin exploring how many there are. I mean, maybe there aren't as many as I imagined, but like it just makes me think that there's got to be a bunch of like theodicies, so to speak, that would apply here that kind of make me want to knock it down to D tier, like universe being big. Because like the universe big thing, like as I said to myself before, I kind of think that's kind of powerful. Like it does something emotively to me that like as a syllogism, I'm not really sure. But similarly here, I'm getting a similar vibe. It's like, yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting. There's some kind of consideration in there, but it's not enough for me to like I wouldn't use it in a debate, right? I wouldn't bring it up as one of my arguments. However, I might bring up the evil god challenge. I might say that at a podium, at a formal debate, but I'm probably not going to bring up this argument because I just don't think it like does it, you know?
I think that's fair, right? I would say either C or D. So I mean, if you want to put it in D, that's fine.
I would say probably D, and also it's my show, so you know, no, not really. But if you really are sort of somewhere in between, I think like a sort of C.5.
C minus. Let's put it in D.
C minus.
Because you're leaning towards D.
That's why you're the academic one, Joe, because you realise that C.5 is a ludicrous thing to even say out loud.
This level.
But bear in mind also, you know, there's room to maneuver here. We could knock the God Rock down and the universe big down. I mean, we could put the universe big in E and then God Rock in F if we wanted to. But whatever, we'll sort of have it hovering around. We'll put it in D tier for now because it needs to go somewhere on the screen. Improvability is what you call it, isn't it?
Sounds good. And let's just do two more arguments. You know, I know there are more on the thing, but I do want to cover the modal argument from evil and the argument for material causality, and maybe we'll go a little bit quicker for them. So,
as you said, there were 200 of them. So if you think these two are particularly worth covering, then let's bang them out and get the hell out of this strange, weird internet meme.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, the first one that we want to cover is the argument from material causality, and so this is actually from philosopher Felipe Leon himself and his article, "The Problem of Creation ex Nihilo: A New Argument Against Classical Theism."
No.
And the argument, I mean, you could run it in different ways, but here's a standard kind of two-premise conclusion style argument. So the first premise is that every material thing with an originating or sustaining cause has a material cause, in the sense of some things or stuff from which it is made. The second premise is that if traditional theism is true, well then the universe is a material thing with an originating or sustaining cause, but no material cause. So then the conclusion follows that traditional theism is false. So on behalf of that premise one, which he calls the principle of material causality, again, the principle of material causality, or premise one, it says that every material thing with an originating or sustaining cause has a material cause in the sense of some things or stuff from which it's made. On behalf of that premise, he points out that actually, like, a lot of the motivations for this premise are strikingly similar to the motivations that theists give for the causal principle at play in the Kalam cosmological argument, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So, like, more specifically, I'll just mention two here, but there are more that he goes through in the paper. More specifically, it seems to be like an outstandingly well-confirmed principle. I mean, like, everywhere we look, we have very strong objective grounds for accepting it. Just like everywhere we look, you know, every beginning that we see has a cause that produced it. Likewise, everything that we see which has an originating or sustaining cause, so for instance, like, my cup, it was brought into existence, it has an originating cause, we find it to have a material cause as well. It was made out of various materials that were refashioned and shaped into it in some manner. It was made from that sort of pre-existent stuff, or things or stuff. And similarly, like a flame, which you might think has a sustaining cause in terms of the oxygen and whatnot, the oxygen there is the stuff from which, or out of which, that's sort of being used up in order to cause the combustion, right? So it's a sort of like a material cause that undergirds it. So then,
what do I do with
the
this?
principle is outstandingly well confirmed. Our universal experience attests to it, and so we have very strong inductive grounds for accepting it. And I guess the second reason is that, like, a lot of people argue that just the Kalam's causal principle is just really intuitively plausible, you know? Like, it just seems intuitive that if, you know, if something began to exist, then something should have produced it. Likewise, Felipe Leon argues that it just seems really intuitive that if a material thing begins to exist, or it's being sustained in being or whatever, it just seems plausible that it would have some things or stuff from which it's made. If just as you wouldn't take seriously someone saying that their log cabin in the woods just popped into existence uncaused, you also wouldn't take seriously that they kind of made it appear, but they didn't make it out of any materials or anything like that. They didn't make it from anything. They just said they just breathed let there be a cabin, boom, it just popped there or something. We wouldn't take that seriously, and so it does seem intuitively plausible that material things come from when they have a cause, they come from some prior things or stuff. But of course, if traditional theism is true, then the universe can't be created from some prior things or stuff. God creates it ex nihilo. If traditional theism is true, there's no prior stuff that God could refashion in order to bring about the universe. So then we get the conclusion that traditional theism is false. And again, there are more motivations for that principle of material causality, but that is the argument.
Yeah, I mean, intuitive. Well, immediately, I mean to say, I feel like to sort of argue from the fact that everything we sort of see materially has some kind of material cause, that like material itself, like the whole edifice, would have some kind of material cause. I think it might just be a kind of category error. Like we're talking about a different kind of event. We're talking about a beginning rather than like a continuation of processes that were once begun. It just seems to me like really easy to say like the beginning of the existence of everything is like just a totally different kind of event to like the way that stuff that exists then goes on to interact. Like, if you're a mereological nihilist, you might think, well, your cup never began to exist. It just sort of like everything that began to exist at one point. Like boom, there it all is, all this stuff, all these subatomic particles, and since then stuff's just being rearranged and bumping into each other and changing from energy into matter and matter to energy and covalent bonds and all this kind of stuff. It's all just the same stuff moving around. Like this event where it all comes into being is like a totally different kind of event. Like that seems like a really easy move for me to make here.
So one thing to say is that if that move succeeds here, it would also plausibly succeed in the case of the Kalam, and in fact you yourself have brought up this point in the context of motivations for the Kalam's causal principle, right? So yes. I think that theists need to be cautious if they're going to be using this argument, and if they also want to accept the Kalam, or if they want to use your objection here, and if they also want to accept the Kalam, because it's equally open to say,
These 4 clicks are a bit
the
hard.
beginning of everything is just so radically different from the various alleged beginnings that we see in our experience, and if you're bringing in nihilism, it changes the scene. So anyway, I just want to caution that at least many theists are not going to want to take that move. That's one thing to say, and then a second thing to say, that is probably just that whenever we have an inductive generalization, you can always bring up that well, hey, maybe the unobserved cases are different in some way. You can always say that. All the emeralds that we've ever seen are green, but maybe there's an emerald that is unseen and it's existing in. Maybe emerald's bad. Maybe an emerald is defined as being green, but whatever. I know what you mean. In a mountain, somewhere in a deep cave, we know that there are emeralds, but they've never been observed. So it's maybe conditions are different there or something, and maybe they're not going to be green. It's okay, listen, we grant that maybe that's the case, but if we want to defeat the inductive generalization, and we want to, defeat our justification for thinking that they will probably be green, we need to be given some independent reason to think that they're actually not going to be green. We need to be given some positive grounds. And so similarly, we would need to be given some positive grounds for thinking that the universe is a material thing that has no material cause. And again, material cause is not necessarily just the material things that we find within the universe. As I define it, as Felipe Leon defines it, it's just some things or stuff from which the universe is made. So it could be it doesn't have to be the material within the universe. Clearly the material within the universe couldn't be the stuff from which the universe is made. But this is where, theists, in principle, a theist actually might be able to accept the argument because they could believe in, for instance, panentheism, which holds that God makes the universe out of the resources of his own being. He sort of refashions himself in some way, or takes some of his own being, as it were, as if it's cookie dough or whatever, and then remolds it and fashions it in such a way as to make physical reality. That could also satisfy the principle of material causality, because it's the physical world is not sort of created ex nihilo, but it's coming from some refashioned pre-existent stuff, some causally prior stuff. So it wouldn't be able to. I'm circumventing an objection that while the universe couldn't have material cause, because material things are all within the universe. So anyway, I'll let you have the final word on this before we rank, because we probably have to go.
I think on the inductive on the inductive point there, like, yeah, well, you can always say with inductive things, like, maybe this one's just different, but like, you know, if you're talking about a bunch of emeralds and I say there's this emerald, maybe it's different, that does seem like something you can always do, but the beginning of the universe is like famously just like completely radical as an event. Like the laws of physics just completely break down, like time just ceases to be a concept, like matter is infinitely compressed into like unimaginable like there are so many other ways in which this is such a different event to anything else we know. So I could make an inductive case, right? I could say, well, look, when it comes to time, the Big Bang is radically
This is
different
out of
from
sync.
everything we observe and how it works in the universe. When it comes to space, the Big Bang is radically different from everything we observe and how space works, you know, in the normal course of affairs, in terms of size, in terms of all this kind of stuff. And so inductively, this other property of like causation, I'm just going to say, must also be radically different from the way that it usually works in the universe as we know it right now. And what's one way it could be radically different? Well, maybe it's like this material condition sort of doesn't exist, right? It's like, I think that'd be a weird argument to make. It'd be a bad inductive argument, but it's not like I'm just taking a bunch of stuff that sort of begin to exist and saying, okay, I think my car began to exist, my shoes, my laptop, my chair, but not, you know, not my computer monitor. No, that sort of pops into existence. I don't know, that's very different. You'd be like, well, why the hell do you think that? But if we're talking about something that is just so different in like every conceivable way, it doesn't seem that implausible to me that would give us at least room to hypothesize that it could be different here. So does it work as an argument for atheism? If you were saying it's for atheism, you would have to be making the claim that you know that the sort of causal principle applies even to the Big Bang material causal principle. Like you're taking on a quite big claim for yourself and justifying it with what's probably a relatively, in my view, weak inductive claim about sort of the material goings on in the universe, which, as I say, is like this completely different kind of operation to something like the Big Bang. So to me, in terms of ranking, I think this is actually really quite low. But I don't know, you seem maybe a little bit more attracted to it than I do.
Yeah, I think it's a better argument than you think it is. That's not to say that I think it like succeeds in showing that doesn't exist, but I do think it's a better argument than you might. Just because, firstly, there are lots of other justifications for the principle that Felipe Leon goes over in his article that we don't have time to cover. Secondly, I still think that it's not clear to me that we've been given like a kind of principled relevant difference between the beginning of the universe as such and other beginnings, which could account for why the former doesn't or couldn't have a material cause, whereas the latter could. Sure, there are lots of pretty radical differences, but it's not clear why they would be relevant to the principle of material causality, why they would be relevant to explaining the difference between them, so such that the principle of material causality applies to one and doesn't apply to the others. And then thirdly, like it's not just the inductive inference that supports it, but also like the intuition and so on. So I would be inclined to rank it higher than you probably, but it's not like it's clearly not like the problem.
Oh no, I'm lost. I lost.
I would put it like
I lost. Shit.
I was tempted to say I put it like God Rock territory, man. Like I'm seriously just like.
No, but listen, you also have to take one other thing that I forgot to mention. So sorry to interrupt, but one other thing that I forgot to mention is that like, remember that like most theists are not going to want to take the route that you've responded with, because again, it's arguably going to require them to give up their principle, their Kalam causal principle, and their confidence that it applies also to the beginning of the universe, which also, you know, all your points will be applying in response to that. So
true, but then like, you know, what about the sort of the agnostic who's just sort of has no skin in the game, and just says like, all right, tell me why there's no God, and you say, well, you know how like everything you've observed seems to have like a material cause. Yeah, sure. Well, like the whole edifice itself, the arena in which that material causation itself operates, must itself therefore have a material cause. And I'm just like, well, why do you think that? Like literally, what is your reason for thinking that? I don't think so. I'm not convinced. It just seems so easy for me to just, and the only thing you have in response to that seems to be something like, well, look, man, you know, like it seems kind of inductive, you know, like I don't know, like I don't see any like reason to believe it, you know what I mean? It just seems like seems kind of strange to me. It just seems so easy for me. Like, it doesn't trouble me at
Right,
all.
and its dialectical efficacy may be different for different people, and this points to a general feature of
That's true.
arguments. You know, like they affect us differently because we come to arguments with different epistemic situations, with different
No.
plausibility structures, with different background evidence, with different background beliefs, and so on. And so this may be more convincing or more troubling for someone who, for instance, a theist who accepts the Kalam, compared to, you know, you or an agnostic or something like that. So, I don't know, I think it has some,
Okay.
we'll probably argue we will have some dialectical efficacy. I'd be inclined to put it somewhere around maybe C tier. I know you probably want to put it lower, but
I would definitely not put it any higher than it, because that means putting it on the level of Evil God. We've only got Evil God in C tier.
we didn't go over lots of bias sections for the Evil God challenge, so...
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Like, what I'm thinking, mate, like, I was gonna say like possibly even F tier, which would make you cringe because like God Rock is on E. I was gonna say like maybe if we like shifted God Rock down to F, we could put it in E. I mean, if you really thought it belonged like in C, then maybe like D is a good compromise.
D
putting
plus,
it along
yeah,
with
D
the
plus, D is fine.
improvability argument and universe big. Like,
That's fair.
is it as good as universe big? Okay, universe is. Yeah, actually, yeah. Fair play. Because yeah, it's sort of like there does seem to be this like cohesiveness to materialism and like
I don't like this.
You know, stuff is made of matter and matter interacts and does all this kind of stuff. Like that just seems to be the way of the universe, man. It seems weird that the universe itself wouldn't abide by those rules. Fair enough. Okay, that's got something to it. I think E plus C minus. I mean, I think yeah. Didn't we put evil God or improvability argument sort of halfway through as well? We said like, didn't we say like D plus or something? So
Yeah, D plus.
maybe like
I would say D plus.
maybe D. I mean, would
Yeah,
you
that's
want
fine.
to push it up into C? Because if you really want to push it up to C, I'm sort of willing to consider it.
I'm fine with D plus. I'm fine with D plus.
Are you sure? I don't want to feel like I'm sort of just like laying down the law here. But I given that I sort of immediately thought this is like borderline F tier territory, I think D is quite a compromise already.
I think I'm just more attracted to like the dialectical efficacy of it. Just like this is good for getting theists specifically to reflect a bit further on their beliefs and the parity between the Kalam and this. So like if it were my ranking, I'd probably put it around C. But you know, I think it's fine to put a D here. So long as we
Okay.
take a D plus.
Yeah, okay. We'll call it a D plus then, if you like.
Okay.
because
Yes, that's fair.
I would just say, hey man, like, you know, fair enough. You think it's C, but if you think it's C and I think it's like F, then D plus feels like a relatively healthy compromise.
That's fair. D plus is fine.
Okay, we'll stick on the thing, but you know, people listening, people watching, let us know what you think. Whose side are you on here? This argument. What did you call it?
The argument for material causality.
Material causality. I want people to tell me in the comments whose side. Those of you who, God bless you, are still with us. Please tell me whose side you're on here.
And-
Where does this belong?
Well, if you're curious, again, check out Felipe Leon's article. So he goes into much more detail on it.
For sure. So one more.
Yeah, one more. This is the final argument. Again, there are many more that we can consider.
The audience goes, one more
Right,
argument.
exactly.
One more argument.
Yes. One more. Okay, it's the modal argument from evil, and it's okay. So it's slightly cheating because it's a version of the problem of evil, but it has like distinctive aspects that I think are cool and fun, and this is ultimately just to get people aware that there are more arguments than the problem of evil. So, the modal argument from evil, I'll present a version of it here. It's a similar argument, roughly the same argument. It's developed and extensively defended in philosopher Carl Brownson's dissertation. His dissertation is freely available online. It's entitled Evil and Ontological Disproof. So, I mean, the rough rendition is like, hey, premise one, it's possible for there to be a world exclusively populated with vast amounts of gratuitous evil and no goods accruing therefrom. Premise two, if such a world is possible, then it's possible that God doesn't exist. Premise three, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. And conclusion, God doesn't exist. It's very similar to the modal ontological argument for theism. The modal ontological argument for theism says that, hey, it's at least possible for God to exist. And since God's a necessary being, God's either going to have to exist in all worlds or exist in none of them, right? So if it's possible that he exists, if he exists in one possible world, then he must exist in all of them. Well, this argument is basically turning that on its head. And it's saying, well, hey, it's at least possible for there to be a world in which God doesn't exist. And again,
Oh my
God would
God.
plausibly be a necessary being if God exists at all. So then, God's either going to have to span all possible worlds or no possible worlds. And since he doesn't span all possible worlds, right, he fails to exist in at least one possible world, it follows that God exists in no possible worlds. So, in particular, God doesn't exist in the actual world. And why think? Why think that there's a possible world in which God doesn't exist? Well, this is where we try to give some independent reason to think that. And it's from the possibility of there being a world which is so overwhelmingly bad that God just would never actualize that sort of world. Either it would be impermissible for God to actualize it, or if you don't like including the categories of permissibility and impermissibility onto God, then it just would be of such a terrible character, the world that is, that given God's character, he just would never actualize it. It would be inconsistent with his goodness to kind of create a world like that.
I'm sorry, I gotta go and check on the meat that is baking now. Still not ready.
So that's how one is trying to motivate the possible non-existence of God. It's from the possibility that there's a world that is so overwhelmingly bad that God would never actualize it. And that world, which is so overwhelmingly bad, is, you know, something like, we could describe it in various ways, but it's like a world exclusively populated with like vast amounts of gratuitous evil and no goods accruing therefrom. Now the question then is, why think that that's a possible world? Well, there are some independent reasons to think that's at least a possible world, and these derive from various modal principles or modal tools that philosophers use to infer what's possible. So one such principle is conceivability or imaginability. Very often we take something to be possible because it seems totally conceivable. I mean, even earlier on in the conversation, right, I was like, well, I think I can conceive of someone who knows that something is wrong and they believe that it's wrong, but nevertheless they're not motivated to act in accordance with it because they just don't care about morality. I was trying to argue, like, that seems at least conceivable. It seems at least possible that someone could do that. So like, we very often just intuitively shift from something being conceivable to something being possible, and arguably conceivability or imaginability.
This is not synced.
And one might think that like this world, which is, you know, populated with vast amounts of gratuitous evils and no good accruing therefrom, like I can describe it in such a way that it really does seem imaginable. I mean, imagine that it's basically just like the world is just a billion-year-long.
This is not.
Just animals experiencing sort of factory farming conditions or something like that, and somehow they're like kept alive or something like that through like some sort of miraculous technology or whatever. We can specify it in various ways, or like new ones come into existence as the years progress, and that's basically just all that it is in the world. It's just these animals that are experiencing excruciating agony for all of time. That seems entirely conceivable, and again, we can specify the world in such a way that like it's not as though the animals later on in life and, you know, later on in time are going to be getting goods accruing from the evil or whatever. So that's one sort of motivation for thinking that this is a possible world, is conceivability. Another one, I mean, there are various different motivations, but another one, and I'll just turn it over to you, is a kind of recombination principle. And these principles go back to David Lewis, and in fact, they arguably go back to David Hume, who said that there are no necessary connections between distinct existences. And what he's getting at there is that, like, if things are kind of like spatio-temporally separated, like this water bottle in the Andromeda galaxy, well, then you can have one without the other, you can have the other without the one, you can kind of recombine them and rearrange them in various ways. They can just... It's possible that things are rearranged in various ways, and it's possible that, let's say there's just a world with only a donkey, or it's possible that there's a world with a donkey next to Donald Trump or something like that, because these things are individually possible, and we can rearrange them in various ways to form other possible worlds, and we can infer that those worlds are indeed possible, so long as the various things in that arrangement are themselves individually possible. This is a very well-motivated principle, surprisingly, in philosophy. There are, of course, objections to it, but there are also lots of motivations for it. If people want to look at philosophers who defend it, they can check out, for instance, Aaron Siegel. He defends recombination principles. But, long story short, is that, like, an individual space-time region containing a creature experiencing, like, excruciating agony, just contained within that region, only the excruciating agony, that's possible. And we can rearrange this region, and regions like it, such that it's only those regions which populate a world. And so the only thing populating the world is just this vast amount of suffering with no goods accruing therefrom. That's how we are patching together or recombining the individually possible regions. And so then, by the Patrick principle or by the recombination principle, we can infer that this is a possible world, and then we get the premise. So anyway, there are more motivations besides the premise, and this is a very controversial argument, but it's interesting. And I want to at least make people aware of these different sorts of ways that people have argued for atheism.
I really like it, man. I think that's quite fascinating. I mean, it certainly seems possible to me that, like, you know, the world of maximal evil possibly exists. That seems like, yeah, sure. Totally.
And it
happy
seems
to grant
intuitive as
that.
well. Like there's nothing inconsistent about that. Like
There's
it just
no
seems like
logical impossibility. Like it's logically possible that like there's just a bunch of suffering, and the question is, would the God presiding over that, would God be able to preside over that? And I mean, I know that there's got to be. It seems like there's got to be something wrong with it. Not least that there's a sort of probably a sort of reverse version that could be put forward of like the possibly best world of all probably contain a god, maybe, if you think that the best world contains a god. So if God possibly exists, like, I know there's probably a reverse that you could construct, but like it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Like, could God possibly preside over just the maximal conceivable agony? In a way, if we're going to just very easily say that it's possible this world exists because, well, it's logically possible, then we could also just as easily say, well, yeah, it's logically possible that God could allow a bunch of suffering. You know, it seems very unlikely, it seems very strange, but it doesn't seem like logically impossible that he would just create a bunch of evil and suffering. I don't know, like, maybe it is. It's just kind of hard to say. I do definitely find this really interesting. And of course it relies on this modal logic move, you know, if it's possibly necessarily the case, then it is necessarily the case, which is, you know, not everybody accepts that. So, I don't know, man, like, I think that's really interesting, how powerful it is. I'm definitely going to, like, bring it up with friends and use it, but more because it's kind of a headache to work out. I feel like if you were, like, really smart and thought about it for a long time, you could definitely come up with some pretty good reasons why it's not a knockdown argument, but, like, the way it initially sort of strikes me, I'm like, yeah, man, that's got something to it. I think that's pretty cool. It's pretty powerful.
I think it's a very interesting argument, and it's not like immediately obvious like where exactly it goes wrong. And you might find theists objecting to different premises, so it's not exactly like a, you know, clearly mistaken argument. And like I said, I mean, there is independent motivation for each of the premises, it seems. Like motivation that is independent of a prior rejection of God's existence. So I'm inclined to, I mean, again, because we're nearing the end, we're not going to be able to go through a bunch of different objections, and, you know, the objections concerning the recombination principle and so on. But, you know, I just want to put it out there for the audience to think about it. And just in terms of ranking, I mean, I don't know where you fall, but I'd be inclined to rank it, like, reasonably highly. I mean, certainly not as, like, standard problems of evil and so on, and maybe not hidden as level, but maybe I'd probably put it B, honestly.
That would put it at the level of religious confusion, which I think, especially given that this is like an argument against, like, just God. It doesn't sort of rely on different religious traditions, and it does again rely on this, like, moral element of God not being able to reside over evil, but it seems much more to, like, attack the root. Like, this is God's existence. It's not some, like, sociological analysis. I think it's got to be at least as powerful as that. So I think B tier is not a bad shout. I think it's probably better than the Evil God challenge.
Yeah, I think so.
And you're right that it's probably not as good as Divine Hiddenness. It might actually function better, like, as a syllogism, as an argument. It might sort of maybe, but, like, in terms of its persuasive power and cultural relevance and history, it's definitely nowhere near. So I think B tier sounds pretty fair.
All right, well, it looks like we probably have our tier list complete.
Cool. So what did you call this one? The modal argument from evil?
Yeah, the modal argument from evil.
Modal argument from evil. It's an interesting name for it. I wonder if that's I mean, is that your label for it, or is that just what it's known as?
So I mean, Carl Brownson calls it the ontological disproof. I think that sounds horrid. That sounds horrible.
I think maybe like the modal argument from possible evil is fairer, because like the modal argument from evil seems to imply that this evil like kind of does exist. Like we've got this single evil that we're arguing from. It seems like it's
Well,
the possibility.
Well, that's what the modal is.
Yeah,
coming
I guess that's what the modal thing does. Or like the argument from modal evil. Then.
Oh yeah, the argument from possible evil.
Whatever the case, we'll just call it the modal argument from evil for simplicity's sake. But yeah, you're right. That's complete. So, right, S tier, problem of evil. A tier, divine hiddenness. B tier, religious confusion and the modal argument from evil, or the argument from modal evil, or the modal argument from modal possible evil that's possibly modal. C tier, the evil god challenge, sitting alone. D tier is our most populous category, with universe big, therefore no god, the improvability argument, and the argument for material causality, although controversially, because the show thinks it should be higher. In E tier, we have the god rock, which is sunk on our tier list down at the bottom, and may, on further reflection, sink further down to the F tier, given that it does just seem to exist in a different category to these kinds of arguments. Having said that, I just think it's not like, I mean, trivially, we could come up with something like, you know, my dog bit me today, therefore God doesn't exist, which would probably go in the F tier. And so I think we sort of need to almost ceremonially leave the F tier completely blank, as a reminder that like there are literally as many arguments for and against the existence of God as you can possibly imagine, if you're allowing them to be bad ones. So I'm kind of happy with leaving the F tier blank. And you know what, I think this is a relatively healthy looking tier list, but like I say, I'll be interested to see what other people think. So unless you have any particular last minute changes you want to make to it, I think I'm happy to sort of wrap it up there.
Same here. I think it's great.
Awesome, dude. Well, hey, thanks for what may well be the longest episode yet of the Within Reason podcast. I've done some pretty long ones before. I might have done like 2 hours, 2.5 hours. I don't know where we're at. I think we're about 2.5 hours in terms of recording, maybe a little bit over. I'm not sure I've done that before, so thank you for the time, especially given I think our last one was probably pretty long as well, so you've probably spent more time on this podcast than any other guest, with the exception of William Lane Craig, who I've had on about 1 billion times. So, man, Joe Schmidt, if people want to check you out, links are all in the description. Majesty of Reason. You've got some published work as well. We'll put everything that you want in the description. Anywhere else that you want to direct people? Any other links you want to mention?
I think
it's a
that's
really
all.
short
Thanks for
one
having me
because
on.
I
I
really
think
don't
this was
have
really fun,
time.
and I hope it was edifying for people.
Me
I
too,
got
man.
41
I've had a really good
got.
time, and I think it's going to be I think it's going to be a fun one to listen to, hopefully, as well. So, dude, awesome. Good stuff. Thanks for coming on.
Alright, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you too. What an incredible episode. Goodbye.
Sometimes